Hi, I'm Jeff Randolph, co-founder of Pure Healthy Way and co-author of Pure 5-2 Transformation in 21 Days. Thank you for joining the Pure Fast and Listen course. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever wondered why it is or how it is that we got into the predicament that we're in today, where in America and Western countries nearly 2/3 of all people are overweight? And according to the CDC in America now, 70% of all people have taken at least one prescription drug in the last 30 days. Over half of all people have taken 2 drugs in the last 30 days. And in fact, 1 in 5 people has taken over 5 drugs. Like, what's going on with our health system? By the way, the drugs that people are taking today, at least in the United States, the most common ones are antibiotics, antidepressants, and painkillers, which tells me that there's something really wrong. Which is why here at Pure Healthy Way, our slogan is Eat Pure, Feel Fantastic. So we're going to start out by looking at things from a historical perspective. We live in the UK now, and one of the fascinating things about being in the UK is that there's this great sense of history, and the most interesting people to study are the Victorians. But a fascinating thing happened in the mid-Victorian age around 1850. People were actually really healthy. And we're going to start by looking at them and see what happened ever since then. The mid-Victorian UK was the nutritional golden age. The development of rail networks combined with improved agriculture with crop rotation methods using clover and turnips brought abundance of fresh, cheap, and whole pure foods from the countryside into the cities. Even the poor people could afford abundant vegetables and fruit like onions, cabbage, beets, watercress, and apples and cherries were low cost in season. In addition, there was plenty of fresh meat, and for the poorer people, the organ meat and offal meat was commonly consumed, which is actually the most nutritious part. The food, of course, was all organic. There were no synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, or herbicides, and the soil was still healthy and mineralized. In addition, there was no processed foods. The flour was stone ground and mostly locally, and there's very limited sugar consumption. In addition, there's a high level of physical activity, and this allowed people to burn a lot of food and eat a lot of food, and then combined with the nutrient-dense food meant that the average person ate 10 times the amount of micronutrients and phytonutrients as people eat today. And as a result, the life expectancy, if you ignored childhood disease and communicable diseases, was actually equal to our life expectancies today. And in addition, the level of degenerative disease was about 1/10 the rate of what it is today. And coronary disease, heart disease, and cancer were very uncommon. One of the big changes that happened to the mid-Victorians was between 1850 and 1900, the sugar consumption went from about 20 pounds per person per year to over 100 pounds. And as you can see in this graph, the rate of sugar consumption has continued to increase. Another big change that happened about that time was steel rollers were invented for making white flour. Prior to then, each village had its own flour grinding mill that used stone rollers to make mostly whole grain flours. But in 1874, the steel rollers were invented, and suddenly a mass centralized industry was developed, and white flour became prevalent. In addition, fresh foods were replaced by canned factory foods with added sugar and added salt. Now, one of the consequences of this was by around 1900, most people in Britain had terrible teeth and dentures became common. The average person couldn't even chew nuts or vegetables with their own teeth because they were rotting away from all the sugar in their diet. And surprisingly, the British Army found they had to lower their recruiting standards because the average person was so malnourished that the average height had dropped by about 6 inches. One big development of the whole industrialized food process that happens around 1880, 1890 is the development of margarine. And this is developed initially in France for the French military, but it was a synthetic butter. And a few years later, one of the sources of the oils that were used in it became vegetable oils. And this was a huge change in the Western diet because prior to then, vegetable oils just were not a commonly eaten food source. But there was a huge amount of oil available when electricity became common, and suddenly everyone that was using oils for making lamp oil had to find a market. One of these markets was food, and one of the first really synthetic foods was the development of shortening in the United States. There's shortening called Crisco was developed, which stands for crystallized cottonseed oil. And it was made hardened or crystallized through the process of hydrogenation. In the process of doing that, you form trans fats, which is a category of extremely unhealthy fat types that are in so much modern processed foods. And it's interesting, you can go and download a Crisco cookbook that was given away free in 1919, and it talks about the health benefits of Crisco oil compared to all the old-fashioned oils like butter or beef drippings. What nobody realized at the time was just how toxic these trans fats were. Now, a few years later, there were some very fascinating observations made by actually an American dentist by the name of Weston Price. And he started asking himself the question, why is it that all my patients are coming in with poorly formed dental arches and all this tooth decay? He said, I can't believe this is the natural plan for people to have this sort of degenerative disease. So he started an odyssey where he went around the world looking at about 20 different native cultures to see what they ate and how healthy they were. Weston Price developed this amazing term called displacing foods of modern commerce. And anywhere he found people eating canned foods, white sugar, refined flour, or vegetable oils, he found their health had degenerated. In the span of one generation or less, if somebody left their native diet and started eating the Western diet, invariably degenerative disease would follow them. Since the 1930s, when Weston Price did his studies of native populations, things have continued to evolve in the Western food supply. A few big changes have been the development of synthetic fertilizers, which continue to degrade the soil quality where our crops are grown, but also the introduction of herbicides and pesticides, which are toxic compounds that were actually developed from nerve gas agents in World War II. This graph shows how these modern agricultural practices have reduced the mineral content in our food today. In addition to that, modern food now is made with GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. And these are plants, primarily corn, cottonseed, soybeans, and rape or canola seed, that are modified from their natural genetic state so they can either produce their own herbicides or pesticides in the plant material itself, or they can resist the application of herbicides and not die. So the farmer can spray the entire field and not have his crops die, but have the weeds die. One consequence is the use of the herbicide glyphosate has increased dramatically since GM crops were introduced. And much higher levels of these toxic residues are now found in the food. The World Health Organization has recently officially announced that glyphosate or Roundup is a carcinogen, and this is based on a huge amount of research that's been done over the last decade or so. For example, this article shows the relationship between the deterioration of health in the United States and the use of Roundup or glyphosate. This first graph shows the rate of intestinal infection deaths versus glyphosate use. The next graph here is the prevalence of diabetes and glyphosate use in GM crops. The next graph shows the rate of deaths due to obesity and glyphosate use. And finally, the last graph shows the relationship between the rate of thyroid cancer and glyphosate. So there's just a whole host of health problems that glyphosate is causing. In the case of Bt GMO foods, the plant is engineered to create a toxin in the part of the plant that we eat. And this may be one of the reasons why the cases of food allergies have increased dramatically since GMO crops were introduced. It's tempting to believe that the government will protect us from unsafe foods in our food supply, but that's just not the way the system works. In the case of the United States, Monsanto executives are now in positions of authority in the Food and Drug Administration, and that's how GMOs were actually approved in the first place, using Monsanto's own data in very short 3-month trials. A few years ago, there was a group in France that did some 2-year trials feeding rats GMO food and Roundup, and what they found was very different than the results that the US FDA based their approval on GMO foods on in the first place. And they found that rats fed GMOs and Roundup developed tumors at a very much higher rate than their control groups. And interestingly, this study was criticized by scientists and other people that were on the Monsanto payroll. No surprise, really, so protect yourself by eating organic food whenever possible. If you live in the UK, the situation's better than the US because GM foods are labeled. However, GM animal feed is used, which means that if you buy meat or dairy products that are not organic, they do have GM or herbicide residues in them. As well, when you eat out at restaurants or bakeries, be aware that quite often the ingredients that they use can be GM without you knowing it. Did you know that you can be dieting and exercising and doing all the right things and still not losing weight? The reason is there's a category of compounds in our environment today called obesogens. Obesogens are man-made chemicals that are endocrine disruptors that are found in our food and environment today. And even animals in environments that are subjected to pollution and man-made forces are showing the same impact of gaining weight over the last 30 years or so. So where do these obesogens come from? In our food, the obesogens are added hormones, antibiotics, and herbicides, and that's why it's important to eat organic wherever possible. But other surprising sources of obesogens in our environment are the non-stick cookware, the Teflon that we use, or the water repellents in clothes and stain-resistant compounds in furniture and carpets, as well as plastics that are used in bottles, food can liners, even store receipts, as well as laundry items and cosmetics and shampoos are sources of obesogens. So that's why it's important whenever possible to avoid contact with plastics and use organic products. And now we've saved the worst for the last, and that is ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods are the snack foods, the junk foods, the food that comes packaged and processed and ready to eat and is simple to eat. You just rip open the package and start to eat it. It's extremely palatable. It's actually designed to encourage addictive behavior and overconsumption. As a result, the obesity rate of various countries is a function of the amount of ultra-processed foods that are found in the diet. And which two countries come in first? The United States and the United Kingdom. I hope this doesn't seem all too overwhelming for you, but it's good to know how we got to where we are today so that we can actually do something about it and make changes and transformation in our life. So stick around, that's what the Pure Fast and Listen course is all about.